On this episode of the podcast, we talked to Dan Hendry about getting students in high school to ride the bus. But it's really about getting schools to offer bus passes to students and then educating students on how and why they should ride the bus. I love this conversation. Dan's passion for making an impact is incredible. And he's actually having a lot of success. You can check him out at dhendry.com, and we'll make sure there's links to his website. This guy's doing some really, really great things because he thinks they matter. Educating students on how to ride the bus could have generational change in getting people to choose something other than an individual car when they go to college or when they get their first job. Now, we know that Gen Z is looking for experiences over things, and they're looking to live in cities versus living in the suburbs. Well, those two decisions make it so that somebody doesn't really want a car. Don't make them have a car. And if we could be teaching students how to ride the bus and why they should ride the bus in high school in those very transformative years, they will know how to choose the bus for their first day of work. And so Dan and I unpack a lot of ideas in this podcast. He's really fascinating. I think he's going to be a repeat guest just because he's been working in a variety of different things. The Kingston, Ontario school project was just one of the things that he's done that was really impactful. We need more people like Dan that are connected in their community, passionate, and doing whatever that takes to get involved and contribute and make progress. Dan has his own TV show, actually. So he's a really great guest. He taught me a bunch. And I think you'll see after this episode, I get a lot better with these conversations. And it's directly from the tips that Dan gave me. So really love this episode. Dan is a major thought leader in transportation. And I think you'll learn a lot from him in this episode. So it's November 17th, 2020. Most schools in the United States are currently on lockdown and students aren't going to work. But for most of us, taking the school bus to school was a very normal part of life, and eventually it'll be a normal part of life again. One of the topics I wanted to cover here on Commute was the idea of commuting to school. And today we're going to talk with Dan Hendry, and I'll let him introduce himself. And we're going to talk about how the future of commuting requires us to train the youth of today, how they're going to utilize transit and mobility. Dan, welcome to the Commute podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. So commuting, this is one of my favorite topics, especially around youth.
Well, tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do for a living and your background.
For sure, man. So I actually work part-time. It's been about 10 years with Limestone District School Board. It's a public school board here up in Ontario, Canada, in Kingston, Ontario, actually. I work on a variety of projects, usually, local food stuff and waste and energy. But kind of my bread and butter now, or something that I've helped create and I'm very passionate about, is actually youth transit programming here in Ontario, Canada.
So I found you originally because of your TED Talk, throwing our car culture under the bus. Some strong words there. Do you mind telling the audience a little bit about the content of the podcast, why you did it, and maybe we could dig into some of the data? I was just really fascinated about the granularity of the data that you had, and that you had so many statistics about individual utilization. So maybe give us a 5,000-foot view of the TED Talk.
For sure. It's basically, the last decade of my life. When I was a kid, I never knew I'd love buses this much. I always thought I was going to be Indiana Jones. Didn't turn out that way. It was a unique opportunity. So I do have a background. I have a business degree, and I did actually a degree in sustainability in Sweden. And I was always in the back of my head about kind of efficiency, the business case of things, how things work, and how things can be adapted to be more efficient and better. In 2012, we had a chance here in Kingston. The City Kingston Council at the time, so the city, they said, you know what, we're going to let grade 9s ride for free. And they talked to the local school board, and they said, how are we going to do this? And logistically, they're two separate organizations, two different businesses, really. The public school board system is in the business of education. I kind of put up my hand at the time and said, I'd really like to dig into this and see how we can make something work. So the initial concept was free transportation from the city or for grade nines. This is when I went to the director of education at the time and said, listen, we have this great opportunity. They have these free passes now, right? We got to teach them how to ride a bus. Nobody's showing them how. Like, when's the last thing, in your lives, you maybe have done something without, somebody showing you or teaching you or kind of mentoring you, right? So this was the start of it, really, Ryan. It was the idea of getting kids on buses and literally taking hundreds of kids every year out on a moving field trip where you showed how to ride a bus. And that's been going since 2012. It's very different from the initial one. Actually, the initial year I had to take 50 kids down to City Hall. And at one point, because they're lining up and they're getting their passes and we're processing, well, another cohort, because a big line, so they did a tour of City Hall. Well, I'd worked part-time for both the school board and the city at the time. I thought I was going to lose both my jobs. I had one kid going down the banister at City Hall, and this is an old building, Canada's first capital type of thing. Anyway, we've now moved it, so it's shifted a bit. So kind of a really good relationship with the local transit authority. We work kind of working together. Right now in Kingston, grade 9s through 12. So every year, the next year got free access. I don't like the word free, and we can talk about that. It's really about building a transit culture. And that's what that 10X was about, focusing on youth and teaching them how. It can be intimidating. And there are lots of stories. I think we can dig into them, but anything from, can you eat on the bus, to taking your bike on the bus, to how do you stop the bus, right? Like all these questions. At age 14, they can't drive yet. They want some freedom. It opens up the community, a lot about equity and getting to school and sports extracurriculars. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of the base of the program, but I'd love to dig into any parts you're interested in and talk more about kind of youth transit programming, the importance of it.
So first, I think some of the listeners are going to maybe be in a community where they may want to try something like this. So what were some of the responses that you got maybe in the beginning that were negative, that you had to work against, or what kind of hurdles did you have?
I think some of the biggest hurdles weren't necessarily negative, but you're kind of going kind of salmon upstream type of thing. It's just people didn't understand why. Well, why do you want to give kids bus passes? Nobody uses it, And in fact, during the process in those 8-9 years that we've been building it out, I remember one of the town councilors actually said, this is one of the most impactful social equity programs we put together, in his time. But he'd also in the same kind of time said it used to be called the loser cruiser. So there's this whole stigma around public transit, and this was about hitting at a different age. I tell the students straight up, I say a lot of times, one of the things you're getting here is responsibility and freedom, like this is something that's very important. So I would say some of the earlier hurdles were more about trying to logistically figure it out between organizations, like who should do what, right? That type of thing. In all honesty, this in Kingston, it's a handshake deal between the public school board and the city because it's mutually beneficial and people just work on it together. At a school level, it was not about replacing yellow buses, and that's not what this program is about. It's about the public transportation system. And at a school level, I think part of it was people didn't understand the grave impact it could have on the school community, on the students, on everything. And once students started to use it, I think more people got on board to see the value of it. Early on, I think it was like, well, why are we going to show them how to use the bus? Nobody really uses it that much, That idea, right, over the last 10 years has changed a lot.
Well, using the bus isn't a difficult task, but it is an intimidating task if you've never done it before, or if it's the first time you're using a new bus network. And I think it's a fascinating idea that you're going to take our youth in high school age and start teaching them how to ride the bus. Like, what were the kind of questions that students would have about riding the bus?
So much, and think of it Kingston's a mid-sized community in Canada. So, g'day, or no, that's Australian. About, I guess you would say, is one of the things. But sorry, I went Australian. I don't know why I went there, but no, I'm thinking, so much. Like when you think about it and you look there, like you're talking about like getting your bike on the bus, how to stop the bus, what can you bring on the bus, when does it stop, what's the difference between an express bus, how do you plan your routes, right? I have so many jokes that I kind of have a script now because I've listened and heard the same questions so many times. I've kind of integrated into this whole, more or less, it's like a one-man play. Like I'm on there, it's a big, audacious kind of talking about things and making jokes, anything from like, can you, I say to them, you know, I'm 38, so I'm a bit older, I guess. Now I don't feel it, but I say, you know, do you guys know what a map is? It's kind of like an app, but like nothing moves, you know, like, so I talk about transit planning and Google Maps and transit app and all those different ways to actually get around to anything is like, as about courtesy, you know, hey, these are the areas where it's courtesy seating. So if you see somebody that needs it more than you, please get up, show them how do you lift up the accessibility seats, right? All those little things, but also like, if you feel, one of my things about safety, you're talking about 14-year-olds, right? It doesn't matter boy or girl. I say, you know what, if you feel uncomfortable on the bus, just like you're in the park, if you're sitting on a bench and somebody sat beside you and you felt really, really uncomfortable, like you're in a public space, you're gonna have people sitting beside you. But if you felt uncomfortable, even on a moving bus, get up and move. You're allowed to, and I show them how, right? So it's just all these dynamic things that I think have come to me from parents and teachers and questions from kids. And doing this for 8 years, tell you in September, my life is pretty much like Groundhog Day. I do the same thing over and over again, but I love it. Usually lose my voice by the end of it. I can tell you that much after doing hundreds of these. But it is really about that whole gambit of that user experience of the bus, and then showing the value of, you can get to your first job, you can go on your first date, you can get to a job that you might rather have that's on the other side of town, right? All these different exploratory things they can do in the community, not even touching on the school part, which is a big part of it, but really it's about the bigger picture, right? Do they use it to get to school? Yeah, a lot of students do, right? Or do they, if they can't get on the yellow bus to get home because maybe they want to do an extracurricular, do they have the option now? Yep, you know, like, so it's really about that bigger kind of community piece. But really, I know I'm going on about this, but it's funny because so many people say, well, it's just the bus. You wouldn't know how many adults I've talked to have said to me, well, like, how do you get on? Like, how much do I have to pay? Do I get change? Like, can I use a bill? Like, there's all these questions. I try to hit them all up in kind of one swoop of, you know, really, if I speak real quick, 15 minutes, depending on the time I have, to 30, right? But yeah, it's about so much. It's that whole experience.
Probably a sad percentage of adults that actually know how to ride public transit. And I think for transit or mobility, we're still very much in the early days. And it's an education phase that we're in, where we have to not only have people like you that are champions creating these programs, but you've got to take the mindset that you're educating. And I think it's really smart to be looking at our youth, because our youth will eventually be commuters to work. But do you think about going to school as a commute?
100%. To me, a commute's A to B. Like, we call it a commute, right? It's a car, it's a bike, they're all different. No, it's not. Human is getting from one point to another, right? In my mind, that's how it kind of works, right? And yet, you know, in North America, we've kind of built our systems around our transportation systems around the car, right? Like, when I went to school in Europe, it's very different, a very different infrastructure, right? Because it's older infrastructure and it has to be built differently. So I think that, you know, our environmental factors are huge. But yeah, no, I think going to school is a commute. It's A to B, right? So, and then it's not just that school. Like, it's fascinating when you look at the data. About 50% of the rides are not before and after school, Monday through Friday, kind of 7 to 9, 3 to 5. But 50% of the rides are, you know, all over the place. It's during the day for cooperative education or field trips, or nighttime for jobs or volunteering or friends, right? And this pass in Kingston actually runs all the way through the summer. So those rides in the summer, it's about kids getting around the community. So I think it's so much more, but for sure it's a commute. It's not just about school though. It is about this transferable skill set. And I want to say that because I think when we were mentioning before, it's just this idea that you have these kids in this mid-sized community that if they go to post-secondary, go, you know, live in a different community or even travel, you know, they have this skill that if they go to a different country, if they come down to Ohio, you know, in the States, and they come to any city there, they feel more comfortable. Okay, no, I can figure this out. Okay, here's the bus. Okay, here's how it's going to work. You know, this is also cost savings. You know, it's expensive, right? Uber or taxis or different kind of means of transportation if you travel. You know, quite frankly, when I got to travel kind of after my schooling, after university, you know, I relied heavily on public transit, but it does take a confidence of understanding the basic idea of it before you go to a different country and don't understand the language of that transportation system. So I think it builds that up, right?
So you said a lot in there I want to unpack, and it's really all around
Please.
preference. It's all around preference and how you're using transit to be liberating. But for many teenagers, they see the driver's license as freedom. So what are you saying to a 16 or 17-year-old to get them to think about freedom in a different way?
Well, I think that's part of the key. In grade 9, they're 14. So they still have 2 years. So it's not just what I say, it's what they do. So they have 2 years of normalizing it. They have 2 years of using it, 3 years. Plus, then you get all the kids or the students that can't maybe don't run out and get a car. You know, like in my family, we had 3 boys growing up. We had a couple older vehicles in a small town in Canada, and it just we didn't have the keys, right? My parents couldn't afford it that way, right? Especially putting us online and the expensive insurance. So it just gives one more option, right? But what I like about it is if you know 14, if you normalize at 14, 15, 16, I never say I say you get your driver's license. I have a driver's license. But my wife and I, we only have one car because I use transit a lot and we kind of work together. But I think part of the goal is when they're an adult and they leave the house, is their head thinking, let's just get into the car? Or is it, I'm going to carpool today. I'm going to bike today. It's a nice day. I'm going to drive today. I'm going to take the bus today, right? So I think what I like, it builds like a multimodal kind of mind frame, if that makes sense. Like as they have the confidence to have a different selections as they grow older and as they kind of go through life. And I think that's really exciting. And sometimes I'm excited, not that you can perfectly measure it, but just to wonder of the impact we've truly made on students. You know, well, what percentage might have never used the bus and what percentage might now feel comfortable through their whole life, right? And I think that's a pretty cool thing to think about.
It's like, what's your default when you leave the house? Are you thinking like, I'm just getting in the car, or do you have any different thinking? And calling it a multimodal way of thinking is spot on. I come from the approach of I want people to start thinking about transportation further ahead and being able to plan more of these trips that you take. I think the multimodal mindset and the planning ahead mindset go hand in hand. The car as a default almost causes you to erode into a lifestyle of non-planning when you can just default to a mode that doesn't require any kind of planning. But then there's collateral damage by not planning what time I'm going to get in that car. I have an unknown amount of traffic. I have an unknown expense in wasted gas. I have an unknown amount of time. What do you tell a 14-year-old in regards to savings? Think about our driving years. Did you tell me that you save 10 grand a year on not having a second car, something like that?
Well, yeah, like I think what I've read in Canada before. Yeah, it's kind of like if you think, and I say that's exactly kind of what I say. I say, listen, guys, like I'm not telling you to buy a car. I mean, again, like I said, I have a car, right? Like, and my wife and I, we share one, right? But we don't have two, right? And a lot of families have two. And what in Canada, what I've read at least, I think it's if you include the car payment, the gas, the storage, the parking tickets, the insurance, the everything, it adds up to about $10,000 operationally per year.
Yep.
And I look at that and I'm saying, guys, like when you're making $15 an hour or $14 an hour in Ontario for minimum wage, it might be a little bit lower for students. I mean, geez, when I started, Brian, it was like $5.90 or something. Again, making me feel old. And then talking to my dad, and I think he was like 70 cents. So I guess
$5.75.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? But I say, like, think about that money you could save. You could aim for that car. If you want that car, that could be your thing. But maybe you're paying for university. Maybe you're paying for a trip. Think about the money you're saving. That's how I kind of angle it. I never push away the car. Like, again, you know, that is right now a normal part of our culture, right? And it's a big part. And we kind of built, quite frankly, North America around the automobile, right? If you think of it in design and urban planning. But what I'm telling a student is if you're paying, you know, if you're pulling 100, 200, 300 bucks a week, where else could you put that money, right? And that doesn't mean you can't have a car, but this can open up more opportunities. Like when I was a kid, I'd probably not care as much about a car as I would have always wanted to travel, right? So, and that, you know, just to put that money in there, or I wanted to go to school, right? So those types of things, right? So I really just try to put it in a way of, you know, it is a cost savings. And the longer you can kind of do it this way and utilize transit, the more you're going to save.
So you're kind of doing it like a smoking cessation campaign where it's, you know, they've tried everything to make smoking not cool, but the thing that kind of works is when they tell people not to waste their money on it and all the things that you're going to be able to buy.
Yeah. My dad could have brought I think he had smoked growing up. He would have had enough money to buy a Porsche or a real nice bus, I guess.
Well, but, hopefully he had some nice Marlboro gear back in the day. I don't know.
Well, exactly. You know.
And then this transferable skill set. Beyond just riding the bus, what do you think you're giving these students Not just how they're going to use the things you teach them to ride transit. What do you think this is teaching them about how to live their life?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because this is a slightly different. So part of my job, I get to do other cool stuff like with schoolyard naturalization and that type of thing, more trees and getting kids outside. I mean, at 38, that's how old I am. I still remember I grew up in a smaller town and it wasn't developed as much, right? I literally, the stories are so cliche. I'm sure you have them too, but come back when the lights are on type of thing. You're riding your bike out and sucker fishing and crayfish and stuff like that. Like that was my life, right? And so there's this really cool thing, I think it was out of England, that talked about like the area of influence of past generations, right? So like your great-great-grandfather, I think it was like in this study, it was kind of like his area in which he could wander as a child was, fairly big, the diameter of it, right? Like I forget how many miles, but it was several, like 3, 6, 7 miles, I think, in any direction. And that could be fields and stuff. And then your grandfather, it was still fairly substantial, right? Like, a good circle where he could go. And he had the confidence to get out and do. And your parents and then us and our kids, it's a speck. Like, so it's confidence, it's responsibility, it's wayfinding, it's understanding, it's decision-making, it's critical thinking, right? I look at all this, again, I think I said to you, prepping for this, my daughter, when we bought a house, we were in an apartment for years and we have this little house, and my daughter kind of went, she said, can I go up front? I'm like, oh my gosh, like she was 9, right? Well, at 9, like, my parents they didn't have a tile in me and know where I was gone, right? Like, so I think this builds way more. It looks different, but it is about confidence. It is about responsibility. It is about respect. There are these deeper kind of things that I believe, and I hope that it's instilling in the youth that use the program.
Do you find yourself having to teach parents in the same time?
Well, it's been going for a while now, and I think that questions come in, and I definitely try to address as much in the orientation. But I think more importantly, and I find that kids can teach parents, right? Like I can't come to you, Ryan, and say, hey, you should do this in your life, and you're like, hey, bud, I don't want to talk to you, like don't tell me what to do, type of thing. But if your kid says, Dad, like I just learned how to use the bus, like I'm really excited, like can I show you, or can you help me, and experiment. And I think it's easier to teach up. And I think youth can be a catalyst for that as well. So the more we inspire youth, and the more we kind of show them and give them the confidence and the tools to do that, to use public transportation, and the confidence really, I think it can be very transformative in so many ways. And that's just not with the youth, but it can kind of go up and then down too. I always found it seemed that like, at the first kid, like if you had, a couple kids and your first kid went through it, I was the oldest in my family. I created an easy life for my brothers, I can tell you that much. But the oldest kind of goes through it. Well, now the parents are like, oh yeah, you're going to get your bus past grade 9. Your brother or sister are going to show you how. We know how it works, right? So it normalized that piece, I think, in the community and in the family as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. You've made a lot of this information available through different resources. So if a community wanted to learn from you guys, what type of tools have you made available?
Yeah, for sure. So talk a bit about, so first thing is I would like people to check out, because, just for a very visual, my TEDx presentation, throwing our car culture under the bus, because it's very visual too.
I'll include a link.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, no, I think it's important, because why I did that, for sure, it's, self-ego, right? Like I had to apply, and out of 80 people, and I got on, and I was nervous. My dog could repeat that. I'm not lying. I walked around my neighborhood with repeating that talk. I was scared. There was 800 people there. But why I wanted to do a great job was because the branding. Ottawa's our national city, right? And TED is a big brand, right? But I wanted to like put a nice 10-minute package of the value, the visuals, the data, and that was my goal. If you watch that and you're inspired, there's also, and we can probably link it there too, I'm guessing, the FCM. So in Canada, it's called the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And this is kind of like a knowledge base between different municipalities across Canada. And we made a guidebook because we won an award through them a couple of years back. And this was kind of like a how-to. So it talks about the value and talks about the important pieces and talks about, it has even things in the appendix like field trip forms. Like, okay, the stuff that we use, the email template that I would send out to schools, again, it can be all adapted. Every community is going to be slightly different. But I do think nuggets of this program, even just the teaching youth piece, like if you can't give free passes, even though I don't like the word free, because it really has, it's starting to increase ridership, which is paying. Like, that's a part of its goal too, right? But all this is available in that FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Toolkit, which is one. And then, you know what, honestly, if you want to link my website, dhendry.com, and reach out for individual questions. I mean, I'm pretty flexible. I look at this as being a mechanism that can really do so much around social equity, greenhouse gases, just creating our cities a different mechanism to make smarter, more livable cities, right? And if people have specific questions or want me, my opinion on things, even reach out. Like I'm really pretty open to that, because in my mind, if I can, an idea that I'll help create, I'd be so proud if in 4, 5, 6 years, more cities across North America could be, implementing youth transit programming. Like, I think that's my goal, right? And I love it. Like, I've seen the impact and all the stories that have come to me, like, and I can tell as many as you'd like, but just so many impactful stories, how this program has positively changed people's lives or helped them. Like, why not? Why can't other communities do it? And I think they can, right? So just reach out. So either through the TEDx, the document that we created, or even reaching out to me, I'd be happy to chat.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. We'll make sure all of your contact information and websites are linked and really easy for people to find. And that's generous of you to offer to connect with communities and individuals that might want your help. Our future really depends on the youth participating in programs like this and making better, different choices as they get to car buying age. Do you think this approach of education is transferable into mobility? And I'll kind of share this example and then you can respond. We work with a lot of companies that share mobility, and those companies, one of the first things we do is we educate on how to use a microtransit service, which is you plan through an app, you book it, maybe you get picked up at your front door, maybe you get picked up at a meeting location, and then you ride with your coworkers to get to work. And well, it's generally the same way to get to work as the bus or driving your own car. We have to educate on that. And so, do you have any thoughts on adapting your education programs for an older audience? And can we teach these old dogs to do something different?
I think so. I think it comes to different values, right? So, like, for example, if you're looking about, the bus specifically, right? Like, I think there's a stat that I use, and I've heard from our public health official, was like you're 64% more likely to get your daily physical activity if you use the bus, right? Just walking A to B type of thing, using these types of transportation services, right? I think that, yeah, like, I've been personally asked several times by people in the community that just saw me doing it, and they literally reached out and I'm like, you know what, I got a lunch hour, sure, let's meet at this spot and I'll show you how to use the bus. So I do think it's really important. I think it's a first great step to start with youth, because you're kind of starting that cohort, right? You're starting early and they can teach you up type of thing. So you're starting that. But for sure, I think it is important, and whether it be for the environment, if someone cares about, whether it's about cost savings, right? Whether it's about health, right? Whether it's about the fact that as people age, they might not have the ability to drive, right? Or maybe if your partner had passed away in that case and they were the predominant driver, like, there's all these reasons. So I definitely think that that it's possible. I think it's important. I think the assumption that, oh, it's just a bus and it's easy is the wrong assumption, right? Like, there's so many easy things in life, but they're not always easy if you haven't done it. How hard is it to walk on stage and talk in front of 100 people? It's just a stage. It's just your feet. It's just talking. You know what I mean? Like, you gotta experience things. And I think that's an important thing to really keep at the front mindset. Just not make the assumption that, oh, it should be easy, especially for these smaller to mid-sized communities that, unfortunately, the transit systems, they're not the same as larger cities. It's not as normalized, right? It's not as connected. And I think the other thing, though, like, one thing quick, is just the importance of, it's a chicken and egg game type of thing. Like, you need good transportation systems and reliable and frequent transportation systems to get people, but you need people to get and have and sustain these transportation systems.
Yeah.
So I think focusing on youth too is an important piece, because you're starting to kind of filter people in, if that makes sense, that cycle, and start to push it to a way that you can build robust systems that include the needs of things like micromobility, which is important, that last kind of mile, right? Mm-hmm. Where, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity for multimodal kind of mindset, and, like we talked about, are different modes to think about, not just make the assumption that people know how, right? Or they, like, it could be the understanding of technology, right? Oh, I don't know how to, try to get, you know how many times my mom calls me to find Google for, like, I mean, sometimes it's a digital literacy, right? Sometimes it's accessibility, sometimes it's comfort, right? So I think education is always important, you know?
So if a school or a community has never done this, they may be thinking about like, what is a good use case? They have yellow buses. So what do they need their students using it? And you found a really great use case around field trips. And when I was in school, the best day of the year was always a field trip day. So you're taking this experience that's a positive, and now you're putting them in the bus to take a field trip. They're with their peers. They're having fun. I could see it maybe, it could get out of control. One, what do you have to do to teach teachers to manage a group going on a field trip? And what have been the results of the field trip bus pass program?
Yeah, this is a great segue, like especially around this, because this is kind of something that kind of fell into our laps, I guess, after we worked on the high school stuff, right? So we found, and this was Kingston Transit here, that kind of saw that, like 14 and up were kind of the high school kids, right? But 14 and under, we're getting a lot of paid passes, right? Maybe a kid with their parents, that type of thing. So the idea actually when they did a fare review, I think in 2017, they said, why don't we make 0 to 14 free? And it's not about being free. It's about letting kids get on with their parents, enticing young families to use the bus. Okay, so this was as per Kingston Transit's fare review. But the one thing we were talking, we're like, okay, well, how do we leverage the fact that 0 to 14 ride for free now and schools, right? Because keep in mind, transportation systems are kind of built for the peaks before and after work and school, right? So during the school day, depending on the route, it's usually not as busy, right? So what we did is we created a lanyard pass for each school, or several, that would if tapped, that would count as a field trip. So you could have, and we're not talking about taking bus routes like city bus routes off route. You're talking about pre-existing bus routes, running every day, right? And schools can now use their tap pass. As for helping teachers, a lot of teachers, they're really great. Like, they want to get out and find different ways to engage their students, right? And communities generally have all these great resources. I'll tell you, Ryan, one of the hardest things to do is during the window of a school day, which is really, you got to wait for kids to get there in the yellow buses. And then you got to wait for get them back to school, because the yellow buses pick up and all that stuff. You have a short period of time, right? And there's all these resources in the community, whether they be museums, farmers markets, parks, splash pads, like all these amazing opportunities that usually have programming, or they want students, but it's hard to move students during the day. And a yellow bus can be very expensive, right? So the idea was just this pass that teachers could go out, stand there, and we made the pass because at first Transit said, well, they could just go on. And I said, well, you don't want to be standing with 25 kids and like the bus driver go, who are you? Why are you coming on? You all, so we just want to make it really, the user experience, very easy. They tap the pass once, not for every kid, right? Because they're young, and they get on the bus, right? And again, usually with field trips, there's always educational assistance, right? There's parents, there's volunteers. So I wouldn't even say it's too unruly. I would say the kids are excited, right? But I would say it's not their domain too. It's not the yellow bus. It's not the back of the bus, It's a public environment. So I would actually say that helps in a lot of cases keep them, they're excited but under control. And I've been on the bus watching it. They're great, integrated in with community. And I think that's important. The first year there were 600 trips. And last year, before COVID, there were 900 field trips on public transit. With over, I did a survey with some teachers, and about 75+% said they took more trips because of this too, because logistically, it was easier, right? Like, they didn't have to book the bus. They didn't have to collect money from every student. They didn't have to pay for it, subsidize it. It was just that. And the one other thing I'll add, that Transit's done really well. They have a great customer support center. And quite frankly, I've seen it many times where a teacher will write in and say, hey, I'm thinking of a class trip. And it's because of, they might not have used it before, but they want to get involved. Transit's been fantastic of just saying, well, here's the best route for you, and we'll keep an eye out for you, because they all have radios. So the transit system has been amazing partner in this. And they really enabled so much of this to actually happen, to make sure people feel comfortable, especially the teacher that might be standing with 26 kids waiting to go to an appointment. And yeah, it's really been a community effort, but such an impactful thing,
So how did you get all these groups to work together and share their data? I mean, that can be one of the most challenging things in communities, is to get different groups where data systems don't talk to share that. How did you accomplish this?
Yeah, so Well, so again, the current Kingston, it's really Kingston Transit, right? It's their information. So it's a bus pass. So each one of the high school kids have a specific unique bus pass issued to them, and that's part of the process that we've set up. As for the field trip pass, each school has several field trip passes with a unique number. Again, so every time they're tapped, which schools tapped it, where they tapped it at, and then you can make assumptions from where they tap it on the way back type of thing for knowing that it's a field trip. But generally two taps is one trip type of thing for the field trip pass. As for the high school pass, yeah, it's more about sharing the general information, like not down to like, Danny or Dan, I guess my father called me Danny, but Danny, took the pass this day to go there. It's more about generally seeing the trends, like, oh, look, it's like, and transit does this quite often where they have some extra rider buses where they might have to send if there's some big kind of gluts depending on the community. Because Kingston also has a couple post-secondary institutions as well where the students use transit as well. So transit's really good at adapting to that. But as for the data sets, yeah, it's usually about just working closely together it's really the school board working with transit, and the specific information is, signed off by parents as for, they have to feel like when their kid gets a bus pass, they have to sign off that, the school board's going to be helping them get a good bus pass, but they have to give transit that information of their kid, which is the form that the parent actually fills out. So it's, and then transit has all that user data based upon the unique identifying card of each student, which they do for anybody. I have a bus pass myself, and it's just a different number type of thing, but it helps them plan a more robust and efficient system.
So were there any kind of unforeseen positive or negative consequences from this program?
Yeah, I think you always working with the public and a large group of people, you always get a bit of both. But I would say overwhelmingly positive. Like I've seen anything from like parents saying, "Oh wow, you help with that." My student uses all the time. Not my student. Well, I guess my kid uses all the time. To oh wait, like I don't have to use the yellow bus now because I was the first one on with the yellow bus. And actually, there's an express bus that gets my kid there in 5 minutes. To people like sports teams and extracurriculars happening more often. To granting agencies saying, you know what, can we use more of this grant? We don't have to move the kids this way now, or it doesn't cost as much. Can we use the grant for other things? To after school programs saying that we don't need to use the transportation funds for that. Now we're using food chits to get students to after school programming. Like filling out Grand Theater, that's our local cultural, like our theater in town where they have live performances, and they sell out pretty much every time now because we've worked with them, and again they're working with the city as well, different department, right? But just the overwhelming amount of, I think, benefit. Yeah, as for negative, I haven't really seen too much. I mean, the biggest thing I guess is like this: our school board in our city, it's urban, but then there's a rural aspect too, and because municipalities are in Canada, or in Ontario at least, municipalities are responsible for the transportation system. That means in the school board, which is actually bigger than just one municipality, some students don't get access. But it's also because they're in a rural part, they're more rural, right? It's a different municipality, right? So I would say those are the types of things, but we always try to address it and work through what we can. And some of that is about the access or the education. We've never, if a student, if a school from out of the Kingston area, out of the urban area wants to come and get trained, I've always done that, just because those kids are going to be maybe going to communities or cities or post-secondary as well. So the education we've always done, but I can't really control anything about the municipalities of the transit systems. But I'd say that was the biggest, not negative, but kind of learning in this. And then there's been a lot of learning along the way of how we do it, and we've got it working pretty well now. But again, as those first early days of kids sliding down the banister and me worried about my employment in both jobs, it's come a long way since then.
Dan, you really epitomize a mobility champion. And, I think about a mobility champion as being someone in a community who takes on a role that isn't necessarily assigned to them. It's a job, kind of like leadership. It's somebody who kind of is taking on a very challenging task that others may have failed on in the past. And you're having to gain support from a lot of different people and get everybody to be rowing in the same direction to make anything happen. And I think people could follow your example and be bringing transit into schools. They could be bringing the same mindset into an employer where they may be able to be a champion inside an organization and teach a workforce how to get to work using the bus or using alternative transportation. And I think it's going to take a lot of champions like you, Dan, working on this around the world to make the next 100 years in transportation different than the last 100 years. And the last 100 years have not been very fair. So you've learned a ton. You've had a lot of success in this program in your community, and you've created a playbook now that other people can go and replicate it. So what do you want to do next?
Well, I think I just keep it going. So actually, one thing I'm working on right now is a small social enterprise, more of kind of an advocacy slash consulting, but not really that. More of just a structured way to help bring it to communities. So it's called the Youth Transit Project, and just early stages of working on that. But really, I take every chance, like this opportunity, which I very much appreciate, to kind of to bang the drum, right? And to stay relevant, right? Because it's a really great example, but the world's got a lot of content, a lot of things going on, right? And sometimes things get forgot about. It's not because they're good, it's just because there's so much. So, I'm pretty audacious in the way of, I don't try to do it just because like, look at what I did, but it's more of like, come on, let's like, how do we figure this out, right? And you're right. Like sometimes I look at the world and I think, there's now 7.8 billion people, right? So in 1804, there were 1 billion. That's 9 zeros. 1804, 1927, 1960, 74, 87, 99, 2011, billions, right? It's a very different system, right? And we're living more and more in urban centers. Demographically, like age difference are very different depending on where you are in the world, right? Yeah, I just think it's really important we have effective ways to move people around and think of it more at A to B rather than just buying my car. I don't have anything wrong with the car. Don't get me wrong with that, other than the fossil fuels that contribute to greenhouse gases. It's more about the idea of it's inefficient. And that's what bugs me, right? Like you'd said earlier, like getting up and getting in traffic, not worrying or not knowing how long it's going to take. Yeah, it's because we all do the same thing at the same time and end up in a big funnel, right? Like it's just not efficient, right? And we waste so much time, and we might only live once. And like, I have buddies living in bigger cities, and they spend 2 hours each way in the car. They're not happy. It's not good time. They don't factor it into their cost of living. Like, oh, I make this much a year. Yeah, but did you add the extra 40 hours you were sitting in a vehicle, right? Like, anyway, so I have so many things about that. It's not about like, oh, you like this or not. I look at like, we don't use horses anymore, right? We don't shop at Blockbuster anymore, right? Like, I think things change, and we have a lot of opportunity now with, smart interconnected systems, demographics changing. With COVID, this idea of like, how do we make things a bit more equitable or better? And yeah, no, so to go back to what you said, I think just I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing, and part of it, I still have to work. I still have a small family. I still have, the mortgage and the responsibilities. But I've taken phone calls. One time it was out in the West Coast. I was 9 o'clock at night. My wife she was working on something, and a guy emailed me, a random one. And I said, do you want to talk now? And it was midnight here, right? But I was just whatever, right? Like, I have a good energy for this because I really think it's my responsibility to help make positive change that can kind of live in our biosphere. And I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing, and it could look different ways.
Great.
But yeah, I want to keep on helping others, if that's possible. And my goal would be to get that first one that leads to the second, that leads to the rest, because, there's a lot of small to medium-sized communities that I really think this type of thing can help out with it for so many things,
It's like the world hit a big reset button with COVID. And you've been paving the way with work in schools, but now schools get to kind of reset. They don't have to go back to the way it was. My kids don't need to ride a bus to school in the same way that I rode the bus to school. Things could be very different. And seeing technology come into the school bus, I think, is a next phase. I'm very interested in seeing how dynamic routing, contact tracing, apps for parents, walking directions for students that allow full journey planning so you know exactly when you need to leave, real-time bus tracking so you're not wondering, did I miss it already? Am I there? It could completely transform the way our kids get to school. And if we show them a dynamic way to get to school now, they're going to want a dynamic way to get to school later. And ultimately, preference and choice is going to come down to desire and quality of life. And if it's a better quality of life for them to choose something other than an individual car, they will. And then when they want to have a good time and they want to drive for fun, they're going to have that opportunity. When they need the car to get out of the weekend, there's always going to be that opportunity. I believe firmly that the future is multimodal, like you said, right? And now you're creating this mindset of multimodal choice as the default.
Yeah. Completely, man. I think it's so important. And like you said there, the one thing too is with these assets, like in Canada, 60% of Canadians before paycheck live, or before COVID, live paycheck to paycheck. 60%. And I think like if we got to be saving a bit, different types of things, looking where to save. I think this is just one, and like I think 20 to 30% of emissions from greenhouse gases come from from automobiles, and that's another thing, right? But going back to just that, how often, like if you looked at how often you own your car, how much you're spending on, or how much you're driving it, how often is it just sitting there? Like it's a dead asset in a lot of ways, right? So I think between autonomous vehicles and so many more options, and I just think that, yeah, like things change, and I hope that we can help control it, and the change that is a positive change, right? Because if not, things still change. They just might not go to how we want them to go, right? So I just want to be a part, working with people like yourself to make sure that we're changing it in a direction for the kids that we have, and for the future of just kind of being smarter and more efficient. We have this great technology, and I think that's one thing you'd mentioned with the great, the reset. If they're saying, some people, I see a lot of things on Twitter, they don't like that term. For me, it's not about that. For me, it's like, it's been a push of technology. We've had to quickly adapt, because we've always said, oh, the future is going to be, technology. And we take it on, but then there's this lag too, right? So I think a lot of people are challenged to be like, no, how do we actually use it more, make it better? And the other thing that I think you said that's bang on is user experience. Sometimes it's like, oh, that didn't work. No, it didn't work because it was crap. Now, if you can make it better, and the better user experience, and analyze the data, and actually, it can create so many more efficiencies. Like, how many people, when they turn on their GPS and want, and go, okay, tell me where to go, and it's like, turn right here, there's an accident, right? It's like, okay, yeah, that's better, right? Like, what, like that's, yeah, sure. Let's use this information. Let's make it more efficient, because there's just so much value overall, right? And in our human life, and quality of life, especially,
Well, Dan, I'm appreciative that our world has people like you trying to create the future that we want. And I want to see the same future that you're trying to create. And I hope people will hear this and be able to take some of your lessons and apply it in their own community. I know I've got some ideas about how we can get some of the schools we work with to start incorporating the bus, and maybe there's ways to use field trips. So, just to kind of recap your big ideas, I think it's about catching them when they're young and early and impressionable, not at 16, at 14, catching them and having that 2 years of influence to show them how the bus is cool, for a lack of a better word. Teach them all of the things they're going to be able to do with all of that money they're going to be able to save, and not try to make the car the villain, but show them that there's other things that they can be doing. And we both know that this generation loves experiences, and car ownership doesn't have to be one of those experiences that they're in love with, and that we have to teach the next generation about how transit is part of a multimodal world. And so you're doing some amazing work. I'm so glad I found you and have you as part of my network now.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been great. And yeah, I look forward to working on different things, because it takes people like us, and so many good people probably listening, and out in the world doing cool things in these different systems that can influence that positive direction. So thanks for having me.
Well, this has been another episode of the Commute podcast. Dan Hendry, thanks for joining us.